Volodymyr Zelensky has reaffirmed his intention for his country to eventually join the NATO security alliance, despite this being a known red line for Russia. Well, joining me now is Dr. Alina Polyakova, the President and CEO of the Centre for European Policy Analysis. So very good to talk to you, Dr. Polyakova. Well, given the lack so far, if at all, of a diplomatic breakthrough, does conflict look increasingly likely?
Unfortunately, I think it does. I think we have heard the same message from Kremlin officials, most recently from Mr. Putin himself, that Russia does not plan to invade Ukraine. But of course, the facts on the ground point to the opposite. We have seen the Russian military buildup continue. So regardless of what Kremlin officials may be saying, what the facts on the ground are pointing to is still military buildup with little signals that Russia is actually pulling back some of those activities.
Well, given that so much of Russia's rhetoric centres on NATO, if an invasion were to take place, wouldn't that have the opposite effect? Wouldn't that lead to more NATO forces being deployed urgently to the region?
Absolutely. I think in many ways, the Kremlin's strategy with Ukraine has already been failing. We've seen really unprecedented unity from the NATO allies on their support from Ukraine in different ways, of course. We've really seen Europe and the United States present a common vision, a common unified agenda of supporting Ukraine, shoring up support on NATO's eastern flank. This is certainly not what Mr. Putin, I think, wants, nor is it something that he will be happy with in the future. So it's been very confusing to understand why the Russian Federation started this kind of military intimidation of Ukraine when it seems to be leading to exactly the kinds of things that Moscow doesn't want to see in the future.
Would you say that you talk about that seemingly united front from the West, but would you say the United States, in actual fact, are driving it? The Europeans, they seem to, the very best, have some difference of emphasis, particularly between the French and the German approach.
Well, certainly there have been some fissures within the alliance. I think the message that has been very clearly stated is that there is a red line here, Mr. Putin, that if you invade Ukraine, there will be some severe economic consequences, as well as the kinds of security positions that you don't want to see in NATO. But certainly we've seen a lot of disagreements between the allies, the Baltic states, Poland. These countries are much more concerned about the Russian threat. They're much closer to Russia. Countries like France and Germany have been trying to carve out some sort of middle ground dialogue solution. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is just in Kiev. He was going on to Moscow now. President Macron was just in the region as well. But I think on the whole, there is agreement on the economic sanctions package. And there's broader agreement. There's a very, very clear red line here.
So if Ukraine renounced its desire to join NATO, as the ambassador to the UK seemed to allude to since withdrawing it, and that got some favourable soundings from Moscow. If it did that, though, would it, do you think, stave off an invasion?
I'm not very confident about that. I do want to note that it would be very difficult for Ukraine to go back on that. The desire to join NATO is actually now enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. Again, this is the result of Russia invading Crimea and then Ukraine's Donbass back in 2014 and 2015. So it'd be very difficult for the Ukrainian government to go back on that. That being said, NATO membership for Ukraine has not really been on the agenda. We know this. There wasn't a plan in place to get Ukraine towards NATO membership, the so-called membership action plan that is very, very far away from Ukraine. So Russia has really been using NATO membership as an excuse for this military intimidation. To be very frank with you, even if Ukraine took that difficult step and said, we will commit to some sort of neutrality, this would not satisfy Russia for the long term. That's become very, very clear that once Mr. Putin gets some sort of concessions, he sees that as a sign of weakness. He sees that as an open door to keep pushing forward. He doesn't see that as a sign of a satisfying diplomatic solution.
It's a very interesting point you make. So if that did happen, which it doesn't look like it will, Ukraine says, OK, we won't join NATO. That wouldn't be enough because, of course, President Putin's ambitions are about spheres of influence, aren't they? It's bringing Ukraine, from his point of view, back into the fold, making it something like Belarus, a new Yalta?
That's exactly right. So NATO membership is really a red herring in this entire discussion, to be honest with you. At the end of the day, what Russia wants is a pliant Ukraine that will submit to Russian influence, Russian control, in the same way that Belarus has, in the same way that some other countries in Russia's immediate neighborhood have. So at the end of the day, I think the problem that Putin has with Ukraine is that he's already lost Ukraine. If we look at public opinion in Ukraine since 2014, it really went from most Ukrainians seeing Russia as a friendly country, as a neighbor, to now very deep antagonism against Russia. And Ukrainians really see their path only heading towards the West. The door to the East has been closed for most Ukrainians. And I think this is the reality that Mr. Putin finds himself in. And I think he understands that the only way to force Ukraine to stay in Russia's sphere of influence is to get Western pressure on Ukraine, to not move further west, to close those doors, and to really use hard power at the end of the day. And I think this is the unfortunate moment that we find ourselves in today.
Dr. Polyakova, great getting your analysis. Thank you so much. Alina Polyakova there. And we're staying with Russia, but not politics, or, well, maybe there are some politics in this, because a Russian teenager